2023 blessed us with a lot of excellent survival horror titles. I still haven't got around to playing Alan Wake 2, for example, but I did manage to play the other two major survival horror blockbusters of last year, and they were both remakes of classics of the genre, the Dead Space remake and the Resident Evil 4 remake. Both games deliver outstanding and faithful experiences to their respective franchises, but with that being said, I have decided to ask the question, which one was better? In order to determine this, we're going to pit the games against each other in categories. Those will be atmosphere and fear factor, combat, story, replayability, and finally, improvement from the original. So let's start things off with the atmosphere, as it is the most pivotal aspect of making a horror game keep that scary feeling going throughout its duration. We'll start off with Dead Space. The first few hours of Dead Space feature some of the most immersive atmosphere of all time. The lighting and sound design in the entire game is just flawless. The flickering of lights and the way you always seem to hear the enemies before seeing them builds up the tension beautifully. Dead Space is a truly terrifying game for a few hours, although I do feel as though Dead Space does lose that atmosphere in its later stages due to an oversaturation of combat encounters, but we will go over this more in the next section. But since the combat encounters are so frequent, you generally seem to get used to them and then the fear factor gradually dissipates. But when Dead Space is firing on all cylinders, its fear factor and atmosphere is some of the best this genre has ever really seen. Then there's a Resident Evil 4 remake, which went for a slightly different approach. Resident Evil may be the king of survival horror, but they've always held a sort of campy element close to their chest as well. Resident Evil 4 does have a fear factor, but is nowhere near as tense as Dead Space's. The lighting and sound design here is still strong, but it's not as industry defining as Dead Space is, I feel. But this is because it's trying to do something a little bit different. Resident Evil 4 has its scary moments for sure, but it does lean more into the action horror mindset more so than pure survival horror. The combat is simply too good for you to really feel all too scared in most moments. You've got a bunch of options in your arsenal, and enough ammo for each of your weapons if your resource management is competent. Then that kinda means that the enemies aren't all that threatening when they do appear, although certain enemies such as the chainsaw people or the regenerators do make you sit up and concentrate, as mistakes against such foes can spell a death on the horizon. Resident Evil doesn't take itself as seriously as Dead Space does, and given the reasons I've detailed so far, I'm going to give the atmosphere point to Dead Space. Whilst both of these games are survival horror games, they also both lean heavily into the action horror genre a bit more in my opinion, and that just isn't going to work without a strong combat loop. Thankfully, both games do actually excel in this regard. Dead Space obviously flipped gaming on its head when it decided to make limb dismemberment the focus of its combat. Most games require the player to shoot enemies in the head in order to deal maximum damage, and as such have become hardwired to aim for the head in almost any game that they play. But that won't really work in Dead Space. You've got to detach the limbs of the enemies in order to kill them. You can remove a leg so that they lose mobility, or you can go for the arms, which is a bigger target but won't slow the enemy down as much. That is, of course, unless you use stasis, a power Isaac acquires that allows him to slow down enemies to a near halt. The only caveat to this is of course that stasis needs to be recharged, so you can't just spam it for every combat encounter. The main issue I had with the combat of Dead Space, as I alluded to before, was that there was just so much of it. I began to dread combat encounters by the end, not because the enemies were scary, but because the enemies became more of an inconvenience than a genuine threat. You eventually do acquire so much ammo and health items and credits that you're over prepared for everything, and all the enemies do is get in the way of where you're going, rather than being a worthy adversary. The game still has great combat, but the encounters are too oversaturated to retain any meaningful threat all the way through, although of course this isn't exactly the case for higher difficulties, although we'll touch on that again later. Resident Evil 4 Remake, however, I genuinely don't think I could pick a single fault in this game's combat. Enemy encounters are spaced out the perfect amount, there's this perfect mixture of combat, puzzles and set pieces that the pacing just remains perfect almost all of the way through. The weapon feedback is fantastic, you've got all the standard weapons such as pistols, shotguns, rifles and such. The enemies aren't as varied as in Dead Space, but they still work as intended, and they're fun and challenging to kill. Resource management is really fun with the Tetris style inventory system. Then of course later in the game they introduced the regenerators, who are still as awful as I always remember from the original. Fat blobby balls of annoyance. Overall, I would have to give the combat point to Resident Evil 4, so we're tied at 1-1. Don't worry, no spoilers in this section, but this is the story zone. Not major spoilers anyway. If you've not played either of the games before, then you're still safe. I'm going to potentially be quite harsh here, but I don't think either game really has a particularly strong story. Dead Space has a really cool premise. You come to the Ishimura to see what's been going wrong, and very quickly find out that the answer is everything. Everything has been going wrong. Then you must find your wife Nicole and attempt to escape the ship. The game does some interesting things with Nicole and does have a pretty outrageous plot twist in general, but a lot of the game feels very samey, as you're just travelling to different parts of the ship to fix something. Central plot points are scarce, and I think a game under 15 hours long should have better pacing than this, but it does still give you enough to want to continue on. Resident Evil 4 Remake story suffers heavily from being a Resident Evil game. I've said this in previous videos, I don't really know if people like it that much, but I don't think that there is a single Resident Evil game with a good story. There are games with enjoyable stories. 7 has an interesting story. 4 has a fun story. But if we were to get analytical and truly study the narratives of these games, they're really not great. 4 Remake removed a lot of the campy characteristics of the original and focused on a more serious story this time around. Leon feels more like an actual human being with military level training this time around. He hasn't lost his personality, it just makes more sense given the context of the game. Ashley also isn't just a screaming child anymore, she has her own personality. The set pieces always advance the narrative when they should, but it does have faults. The villains have personality, but I don't feel the same emotional connection between them and Leon to add the stakes. I feel like the villains, particularly Salazar and Sadler, were a lot better in the original game, but this isn't the comparison to the original game, this is the story, and I just didn't feel like the villains did much for me in this story, which is a shame because they're generally strong villains on their own in the original game. It just doesn't feel as personal, they're just trying to stop Leon and Ashley from leaving the island. This is fine, of course, but I feel like the narrative is a bit simple, which isn't a major criticism, the narrative's fine for what it is. I love this game with all my heart. I just have personal issues with stories in Resident Evil games. So, with that said, we're gonna give this point to Dead Space, who retakes the 2-1 lead in this showdown. Next up is replayability and the fun factor. Survival horror and action games often use replayability as a core selling point, given they're usually not very long, and have extra unlockable difficulties to test yourself and clear it in a quicker time. Dead Space, I personally feel, isn't overly replayable due to the combat growing tiring for me towards the end of the game anyway. However, there is an incentive to do so. Once you finish the game on hard mode, you unlock Impossible mode, where you must beat the game with 0 autosaves and without dying. If you die at any stage, that save file is reverted back to hard mode, and you will have to start again. I'm sure some of you watching this will be psychopaths and will have attempted this. I personally can't think of anything worse, but it's a fun incentive for people that want to do that kind of thing and want to punish themselves. There's also an alternate ending to be obtained if you wish, although I don't really think it's worth obtaining in my opinion. Resident Evil 4 Remake's unlockable mode is a bit more forgiving. For one, you unlock it upon beating the game on any difficulty, and it's also not permadeath, although autosaving is removed. And parries are relegated to perfect parries only, removing one of the only methods of defending yourself unless your precision is perfect. Resident Evil often credits itself on its replayability, given that the good ones are usually not too long, and there's always an incentive to replay. Resident Evil 4 Remake, along with the Dead Space Remake, allows your money to carry through to New Game Plus, incentivizing you to keep going and unlocking more items as you get stronger and the difficulty increases. Resident Evil 4 Remake also has the Mercenaries game mode, which isn't necessarily replayability, but it's another thing to do in the game to add to your game time. There is also the Separate Ways DLC with Ada, if that's more your thing. With all of this considered, and considering I just find the core combat loop to be more enjoyable, I am going to give the replayability point to Resident Evil 4, meaning we are now tied at 2-2. And with the scores tied at 2 apiece, the tiebreaker for this versus match is going to be how much the game improved upon the original, as these games are of course remakes. The Dead Space remake is very close to being a 1-to-1 remake of the original. It looks a hell of a lot nicer, and it feels a hell of a lot smoother, but everything you do and everywhere you go is essentially the same. I wouldn't say it's a glorified remaster, I would still categorise it as a remake, and it does improve the original game in the sense of it brings it into the modern era and it still stands out even all this time later, but wholesale changes were extremely scarce. There are side missions now, which were fun to do as well. I did most of them, and were appreciated additions to the experience. Isaac also talks this time around, and it makes the game feel a lot more sensical. A silent protagonist doesn't really make sense in this context, so it is nice that they rectified this. Resident Evil 4 Remake, on the other hand, had a bit more to do. I only played the original a few years ago anyway, and it did feel a bit old, even though I do think that it kinda held up as well. That's a kinda contradictory thing to say, but I don't know, it makes sense to me. The control scheme wasn't intuitive in the original until a few hours in, when you'd got used to it, and the Ashley sections weren't as annoying as I'd been told, but they weren't great either. In the remake, the Ashley sections feel a lot better. The controls in general are more fluid and seamless, you instinctively input the actions needed to do what you intend, and it's just a major improvement. The story taking on a more serious vibe, I also feel was the correct decision. I love the campy nature of the original at times, but I don't feel it would have translated as well to 2023 horror, and I do believe they made the right call in that front, whilst also keeping Leon's personality in check. The removal of the It boss fight was a massive bummer for me, but it did return in separate ways. Lewis plays a larger role this time around as well, and I like that. The villains feel less like cartoons and closer to what you'd expect given the setting, although, as I mentioned earlier, I do feel like they lose that personal connection towards Leon, and that was a real disappointment. I just feel that this game improved itself a lot more than the Dead Space remake did, and that may not be fair, given Resident Evil 4 was older than Dead Space and would have needed more modernising anyway, but alas, that's the tiebreaker, and it's my video, so Resident Evil 4 Remake takes a 3-2 victory over the Dead Space remake. Both of these games are action horror behemoths, two of the best that this genre has to offer all across the board, and both are absolutely worth playing, although in my humble opinion, Resident Evil 4 Remake is the better game. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. I hope that you did enjoy it. If you did, then please let me know in the comments, because I would love to hear your feedback, and if you want to see more videos from me, then that would be fantastic, and you can subscribe to do just that. But that is all for now. Have a nice day, and goodbye.